Claire Sutherland. What don't we know about her? If you look on your table, you'll find a bio. And what I'm going to say is not on the bio, because that's not what she wanted you to know. So Claire, by profession, is a chartered accountant, has held various positions such as Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer at a current firm. But that's not what Claire is here to do or talk about today. Claire has many years of personal experience in dealing with imposter syndrome. And you're kind of wondering what that is about. I could give you the Google definition or the Oxford definition, but Claire's going to tell us way more about that. Okay. She's been trained personally by Dr. Valerie Young, an international expert in the field. She is also the founding licensed associate at the Imposter Syndrome Institute. So Claire Sutherland, thank you for availing your time and welcome.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you very much. Morning, everyone. Have any of you perhaps felt like you're in over your head and you're going to be found out very soon? Anyone? All right, I'm glad I'm not the only one feeling that. The good news is that feeling actually has a name, and that name is imposter syndrome. Now, I'm here because the people at MasterCard Foundation and University of Pretoria have realized that imposter syndrome is something that so many people feel. You might be personally experiencing those feelings during your time at university or in the workplace. And for those of you that may not relate to imposter syndrome, you will soon very see that it doesn't matter whether you are a manager, if you employ or coach somebody, but imposter syndrome is going to be relevant to you as well. So to all of you that may be feeling like an imposter, the first thing I want to say to you is, welcome to the club. A UK study in 2017 saw that 80% of CEOs and 81% of managing directors said that they sometimes felt out of their depth and they were struggling in their role. So even if you don't identify with imposter syndrome, you certainly can learn and need to understand it. Now, today's goal is not to fix you or to fix anyone for that matter. Today's goal is to leave you with three things. The first thing is information. What is imposter syndrome? Where does it come from? How does it manifest? The next thing to give you is insight. How does imposter syndrome show up in a form of a pattern? And then thirdly, to give you tools. And today we're going to give you 3 tools that you can use immediately so that when you start having an imposter moment, which you will find out is completely normal, you'll be able to have everything you need to talk yourself down off of the imposter ledge quickly and rather have a life of being as bright and feeling as bright and capable as what you are. Now, the solutions that we're going to offer to you today is based on 40 years of work by Dr. Valerie Young. She's the co-founder of the Imposter Syndrome Institute. She's a thought leader on the subject, as well as an award-winning author. Now, let's get something straight. Imposter syndrome is not a fancy word for low self-esteem. Think of low self-esteem as this global feeling about oneself, whereas imposter syndrome is very specific to the achievement spheres of our life: varsity, jobs, careers. We don't feel like imposters when we're doing some online shopping or taking the dog for a walk, but we certainly may feel like as an imposter when we're standing up giving a presentation or when we walk into that job interview. So what is imposter syndrome? The first thing I'd like to point out is you'll see that the word syndrome is in parentheses. And the reason for this is that imposter syndrome is not a diagnosable syndrome. It's not something that a clinical psychologist is going to diagnose you with. And it's certainly not a mental illness. Rather, imposter syndrome is something that has been commonly used to explain what was originally termed imposter phenomenon. Now, imposter phenomenon, was first used in 1978 by Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Susan Imes. And they started doing some research on this imposter phenomenon. And they discovered that this is a feeling that is held by millions of people, and it doesn't matter what group of people it is, where we believe we are not as intelligent, as capable, qualified, or talented as other people may think we are. And the crazy thing about imposter syndrome is that it's really nonsensical, because we have all of this evidence that actually shows us that we have abilities and the past accomplishments to believe that we are talented or capable, and yet we still believe it. So despite having the degree hanging on the wall, despite reading the letter of recommendation that you may have been given, or even hearing a positive performance review, we still believe that we are imposters. So if we can see all of these things, hear all of these positive reports about us, what's actually going on? Why are we feeling like imposters? Most imposters are very good at externalizing their success. They may say, yes, I'm successful, but I can tell you why. They attribute their accomplishments not to their intelligence, not to the effort that they've put in, but to external factors. Factors such as luck or timing. It was just a lucky break. I was in the right place at the right time. They may say, well, it wasn't rather that difficult. If I could do it, anybody could do it. Dr. Valerie Young gives an experience of a gentleman that had his PhD in astrophysics from Caltech University. And he said to her, well, if I could do it, anybody can. The other outside factor for our success, we say, is, well, it's the connections we had. Somebody put in a good word for me there. They vouched for me internally. Or maybe if you go into the family business, well, you know, it was my dad or my grandpa. It wasn't really about me. And then others say, well, they just liked me. Okay, they only gave me those positive responses because they liked me. As if our likability was an excellent, thank you very much, was an excellent trait to have. Now the thing is that yes, all of these things, such as luck or timing, such as having connections, do contribute to everybody's success. But it's what we do with it that is important. And if you don't realize that, the next time you accomplish something, you're going to be emotionally unclear as to why you were successful. And what is your default going to be? Well, you see, I fooled them again. Now, this is an important place where we need to start rethinking about success. And instead of using these excuses, look at the real reasons why we are successful. As somebody that feels like an imposter, our greatest fear is the fear of being found out. That somebody is going to realize we aren't as capable as what they think we are. And the anxiety of waiting to be found out. And the anxiety around doing things that we need to avoid being found out is an extremely stressful way of living and not continuing. So we're not here today because imposter syndrome is a great self-help topic. We're here today because we need to understand that feelings lead to behaviors. And behaviors related to imposter syndrome have significant costs and consequences to the person. Imposter syndrome behaviors result in us developing coping strategies. Now, Dr. Suzanne Arms and Pauline Clance, that we spoke about earlier, in their research of imposter syndrome, they realized that we create these coping mechanisms, one, to avoid being found out, and two, to cope with that constant anxiety of when am I going to be found out. So we're going to introduce 3 of these coping mechanisms. Have a look at them. See if you maybe relate to any one of these strategies. The first is flying under the radar. This coping strategy is all about holding back. Holding back in class, not putting up your hand, asking a question, not sharing your thoughts and ideas with people. It's about not going for that challenging opportunity or that challenging project because you are afraid. The strategy here is, if I can keep my head down, if I can stay under the radar, and I can play small, then no one will notice that I'm actually not as competent. The second one, and this is a strategy that is my firm favorite and my go-to at times, and is in fact one of the most common among students, and that's chronic procrastination. We all procrastinate. We're hardwired wanting to avoid doing something that is hard, that's difficult. We are going to avoid a place where we may feel humiliated or not capable. The problem is, though, that when we procrastinate, it starts affecting our ability to carry out our business objectives or our goals in terms of our careers. To give you an example how procrastination helps us in terms of imposter syndrome, there was a very talented student, and she wanted to get into an extremely competitive internship program. Now, in order to do this, there was a lengthy application process, and she had 6 months in which to complete that application. The due date was the 7th of June. When do you think she started? Exactly, the 6th of June. All right. She managed to get it in. Overnight career, lots of prayer, but she managed to get it in. All right. But she didn't get into the program. Now, you might go, well, I can understand that. But you see, she would be able to come back and say, yeah, I am disappointed about not getting in the program. But you see, I didn't really give my best effort. So, it kind of makes sense. But let's take it a step further. What would have happened if she did get into the program? She would have stood there and said, I fooled them again. All right. See, procrastination, unfortunately, means that for a lot of people, they either never start or they never finish that degree, that book they were going to write, or that business plan. Because if something's always in progress, nobody can judge us for that. The last coping strategy we're going to speak about is overworking and over-preparing. Now, some of you may also be very familiar with this. And we're not talking about good old hard work. What we're saying here is over-preparing or over-working more than what is necessary. To give you an example, you're an intern and the director says to you, please prepare an agenda for tomorrow's meeting. And instead of that one-pager, you go and write a 5-page report detailing all of the points on that agenda. It's not necessary. And a lot of the time, what is driving this is, well, it's easy for everybody else, but it's not easy for me. So I need to work hard, and I need to prepare in order to maintain the same standards as everyone else. And we believe that the only reason we're successful is because we've had to study longer and make up for our own ineptness. Now again, let's just have a look at another scenario here. Many of us sitting here may have come from a disadvantaged background. We didn't go to the fanciest of schools. Maybe we were in a rural school that didn't have the opportunities that somebody else may have. So we get into the maths program. We may not have been exposed to AP Maths or the concepts that some of the other students were exposed to. So yes, you are going to have to work harder than some of those other students that may have come from a more privileged background, because you need to catch up in terms of the concepts. But what you certainly don't need to do is you don't need to overwork and over-prepare. Because guess what? You're the person sitting in that seat. You're just as intelligent and capable as they are. So let's take a quick poll. Who of you believe that possibly you may identify with a strategy of flying under the radar or holding back? Anybody? Okay, a couple of hands. Who believe they procrastinate? Overwhelming majority. And those that overwork and over-prepare? Yeah, I also do that as well. Okay. The good news is that all of those strategies work. They help us to avoid being found out. They help us to cope with the anxiety of feeling like a fraud and an imposter. They help us to avoid things like failure, critical feedback, doing things perfectly, and they protect us from humiliation and limitations. But if you overwork and if you overprepare, you're more than likely going to do well because you've put in the effort. The problem is, at what cost? And that's the bad news, is there is always a cost. We pay a price for the protection we get from our patterns. Overworker, overpreparer, you lose out on that valuable time with your family or your friends, or even some time to just have some self-care. For those that fly under the radar, you lose out on opportunities. You may regret not being able to see how far your talents could have taken you. And even though most of us will say, but well, I work best under pressure, granted. But always leaving those important projects to the last minute places enormous amounts of stress on a person. And eventually, the results do suffer. And for all of these, there's going to be some form of financial cost as well. What we need to understand is that the consequences and costs of these behaviors is not just an individual thing, but also impacts the organization. When imposter syndrome causes a very capable and talented person to fly under the radar, to procrastinate on important deliverables, or to burn out from overworking and over-preparing, the organization is going to suffer as well. And that's why it's important that organizations also consider the impact of imposter syndrome. So now for the part everybody's looking forward to, the cure. All right. And today we're going to give you 3 tools in which to use to help overcome these imposter syndrome feelings so that you can start feeling as bright and as capable as what you really are. The first tool is to normalize imposter syndrome. And the first step in normalizing imposter syndrome is what we're doing today. It is about speaking out and talking about imposter syndrome. You know, when I first heard about imposter syndrome, I was like, wait, there's a word for how I'm feeling? And you're actually telling me other people are feeling the way I do? That was my aha moment. That really had a profound impact on me. But talking about imposter syndrome is just the first step. It's not going to solve it. The second step in normalizing this is to consider the source. What is the source behind these imposter syndrome feelings? Now, unfortunately, imposter syndrome has been what we call over-psychologized. And it's become something that's very much an individual thing. So we need to fix us as an individual. But what if I told you there were perfectly good reasons why you may be having those imposter syndrome thoughts and feelings? And as we go through these sources, you may soon go, okay, I now understand. And we turn this to saying, well, how could I not feel like an imposter because of these external sources? And by understanding the sources, we're able to contextualize our feelings more and personalize them less. So first one, who of you were raised by humans? Okay, dumb question, right? But the point here is being that it doesn't matter how well-intentioned our parents were. They passed along messages or expectations that contributed to a child that has grown up and has possibly experienced imposter syndrome feelings later in life. So let's look at a few examples. Who of you were the child that came home with 4 A's and 1 B, and your parents said, what's the B doing on your report card? All right. Yeah, your parents were well-intentioned. They only wanted you to do the very best that you possibly could do. Perhaps they saw education as being the success factor for the family. But because of this, you have learned that the only thing that will do is perfection. And so, no matter how well-intentioned it was, this subconscious message has come across to you. What about the child that came home with stunning results and didn't get praise at all? Okay. Now, again, your parents were well-intentioned. Maybe they didn't get praise when they were growing up, so they don't know how to give it. Or possibly they just expected good grades from you. Or maybe your sibling was struggling and they didn't want them to feel bad. But when you're a kid, none of this matters because praise is like oxygen. And maybe you're on the other side of the spectrum and maybe you were just praised for everything that you did, okay? You got too much oxygen. And what's resulted is you've now come to depend on the need for praise to affirm yourself. But we weren't all brought up in the same family. We didn't get the same messaging. So then why is it that so many of us feel like imposters today? There has to be something more that is going on outside of the family dynamics. That's where we come to discuss a well-known and extremely well-researched theory of the confidence gap. This is the confidence gap between those people that identify as male and those that identify as female. Now, obviously, there's always exceptions to the rule, but it has been well documented that there is a definite gap between the two genders. In a research of over 10,000 people, these researchers identified that a woman's confidence is extremely low in compared to males in their mid-20s and their mid-30s. It then sort of evens out over the 40s and the 50s. And then when a woman gets to 60, she's like, screw it, I actually don't care anymore. Okay. But that's a long time to wait to feel confident. And so what we find a lot of women striving to become more competent. Because they feel, if I just get the next degree, if I just get that next certificate, I will feel I'll be more competent and therefore feel more confident. But in addition to competence, we also need to look at this myth, the myth of the ever-confident male. He doesn't exist. In many research around imposter syndrome, the difference between men and women in terms of imposter feelings are very, very much similar. There are a significant number of men that are on the top of their game, but yet they experience imposter feelings. But let's move away from gender and have a much broader view of these feelings and look at diversity and inclusion. And I think a lot of you sitting here today are going to relate with what we speak about next. It's extremely relevant in the South African context in our history, and as I said, with the group that is sitting here today. Common sense tells us that a sense of belonging fosters confidence. If you walk into a room and there are people that look like you, that sound like you, you're more likely to feel confident. Unfortunately, society has created various biases, including a bias against which accent sounds more intelligent than the other. I was at a baby shower recently for our receptionist, and she was talking about the various names that she was thinking for her baby. And she said to me, she's a Xhosa speaking lady, and she said to me, well, it just depends on which school she goes to as to how these names and nicknames are going to be pronounced. And there is definitely a social bias against accents. The message that you're hearing today has been delivered to over 100 different colleges and universities across the world. And the overwhelmingly majority of people that come to these conferences are the international students. All right. Because not only are you facing the pressures that every other student faces, but you're doing it in a different culture, and more likely doing it in a different language than what you're used to at home. And we can all admit that we always feel a lot more intelligent and confident speaking in our mother tongue than we would be speaking in a second or third language. Then we have those that are vulnerable to imposter syndrome because they are the first generation in the family to have success, the first generation to go to university. Now, first gens can feel like outsiders. An example of this is the example of the US Supreme Court Justice who grew up in a disadvantaged community within the Bronx, and she was accepted to Princeton University. And she said that she felt like a visitor landing in an alien country. And she was just waiting for somebody to come and tap her on the shoulder and say, "You don't belong here." Then if you're one of or only a few of in a group, you are also susceptible to imposter syndrome. Maybe you're studying in a field that because of previous social biases, there are not a lot of women or not a lot of people of color in that field. Maybe there aren't a lot of disabled persons in that field. I think of our National Air Force. And even though we've been a democratic country for so long, it's only been in the last 10 years that we've had a black female fighter pilot come through. So even today, we are still faced with a lot of industry, a lot of fields of study that we may end up being one of few in. And when there's only one of us or a few of us that look the same or sound the same, it may trigger our imposter syndrome feelings. It also places on us an additional pressure, the pressure of being first in a role. Now, we all know who that lady is behind us, Michelle Obama. She's the first black first lady of the US. And Michelle Obama has openly spoken about her imposter feelings that she's experienced. But let's think of some more local examples. Thuli Madonsela, our first black public protector. We've got Nikki Newton-King, who was the first female CEO in the JSC. That's a lot to take on because there's this pressure to represent our minority group. To give you an example, a young woman who was disabled went into a job and she was the first disabled person employed by the company. And she said she felt like she needed to be the super disabled person. Because if she didn't perform, should another disabled person apply for a job later on down the line, she felt that the hiring committee might say, well, we tried to give them a go and it didn't really work out. So there wouldn't be an opportunity for somebody in the future. And this is so true in so many roles, having this additional pressure to represent. The highest level of imposter syndrome is actually found in Asian American communities. And the reason for this is their culture is very much of one where your success as an individual reflects on the success of your family and of your group. Again, extreme pressure to be carrying and having to carry with you. So to be clear, whenever you belong to any group that is on the receiving end of social stereotypes about competence and intelligence, you are the most vulnerable to imposter syndrome. Have you ever felt underestimated? Maybe you were underestimated because you were the youngest. That certainly was my experience going into corporate. Or perhaps you felt that maybe you were underestimated because you were the oldest in the group. This question was put to a group at Facebook, and even the 30-year-olds put up their hands as being underestimated, as being old. So it's all relative to the group that you're in. So why are we spending so much time talking about stereotypes? It's because stereotypes matter, especially in terms of imposter syndrome. There was a study done by Professor Claude Steele at Stanford University, and him and his team discovered this phenomenon called a stereotype threat. And what that means is that it's the unconscious fear of confirming a negative stereotype which causes stress and which impacts performance. And funny enough, the more accomplished you are, the more this effect shows up. One research that they did is they gave a group of students a maths test. Then they placed a block for you to identify which gender you are, male or female. In that test, the female students scored lower marks. right? They had immediately, that triggered this unconscious feeling of women can't do maths. They did something else. They put a block there to identify race. And what happened? The Asian American student scores went up. Why? Because, hey, all Asian kids know how to do maths. All right. So for them, it was this positive stereotyping that helped them improve their marks. But there is so much more than just family messaging, the confidence gap, and stereotyping that impacts imposter syndrome. And these are called situational factors. We're all students, yeah. Now, the segment of population that is more likely to suffer from imposter syndrome are university students. And why wouldn't you? Your knowledge and intelligence are being tested every single day. You are surrounded by extremely well-educated people. Other groups that may also suffer are those that work alone. They are self-employed. They don't have anybody to bounce ideas off of. And essentially, they're doing their own performance review and are going to be a lot more harsh on themselves. And there's become a lot of more anecdotal evidence over the last while in terms of those that work from home and work remotely with increased feelings of imposter syndrome. Because there's not that informal chat after the meeting to try and figure out what actually went down, or you can't read body language so well over, Zoom or Teams meetings. And a lot of the time you're constantly worrying, well, is the guy, my colleague, working harder than what I am? Another situational area is an occupational area. The field of study or work that we're in can make us feel more vulnerable. The creative fields are one of those areas. The pictures you see there of the various actors, writers, and singers are all people that have spoken about how they have felt like they were going to be found out and to be seen as frauds. I mean, we've got Oscar winners, well-known actors and writers. And it makes sense. People in a creative field are being subjected to judgment by people that in their job title are professional critics. So why wouldn't they feel that way? Another field is that where that is information dense and rapidly changing. These are the fields of science, medicine, and technology. And for some reason, in these fields, we feel like we need to know everything and that we need to keep up. But the fact of the matter is, we can't. It's just not possible. And then another situational factor is the workplace culture. Now, this sometimes can be the driving source of our imposter feelings. And a lot of the time, a culture can fuel self-doubt. Now, I'm not pointing fingers or saying anything specific about UP, but rather we're going to look at the overarching cultures in different industries and fields. Imposter syndrome is extremely rampant in the field of higher education, both with faculty and students. And why wouldn't it be? They are surrounded by highly educated people. This picture was taken at UC Berkeley in the US. At UC Berkeley, they have not one parking space reserved for a Nobel laureate. They've got a whole row. Imagine being the professor driving past that. That's an extremely high standard that one is going to measure yourself against. Now, the benefit of knowing this is that you can see your imposter feelings are less about you and more about a performance of the culture that you are in as a whole. So this allows us to normalize these imposter feelings. It allows us to see that it is to contextualize these feelings more and to personalize them less. So next time when you're having an imposter moment, which is completely normal, you need to stop, hit the pause button, and just pull out a bit and have a wider look and say, well, no wonder I'm feeling like an imposter. I'm in an organization that feels self-doubt. I'm a first gen in the field of going to varsity, or I'm studying in STEM or a creative field that is more likely to contribute to it. But we want to just pivot now and look at what we believe to be the core source. This is the source that is shared by everyone who experiences imposter syndrome and for our feelings. No one likes to fail. Certainly no one likes to make a mistake, and nobody likes to struggle to master something or ask for help. But when things like that happen to people who feel like imposters, what is the overriding feeling? It's the feeling of shame. See, we reason that the reason we're feeling shame is everything to do with our unrealistic expectations of what competence is. We hold ourselves to standards that we can't meet every time. And when we fall short and we judge ourselves as being less intelligent or less talented or competent than the others, we feel we are imposters. Now, Dr. Young was the first person to link between imposter syndrome feelings and the understanding of competence. Everyone that shares imposter syndrome feelings has an unrealistic expectation of what competence is. However, when we measure ourselves and our competence, there are 5 different ways in which we do this. As we go through this, see if there's anyone that you identify with. First one, the perfectionist. How many of you don't even need to see the other 4? You know this one is you. All right. Now, the primary focus of the perfectionist is how something is done. They expect flawless performance. Anything else would result in failure or shame. When they get 99 out of 100 on an exam, they feel like a failure. Success for them is really satisfying because they're constantly saying, I could have done better. It's when you give an outstanding presentation, but you kick yourself for the fact that you missed a point. Or you write a well-written report, but there was a typo on page 53. Perfectionists are reluctant to delegate because if you want something done properly, then do it yourself. The next type is the expert. Now, we're not saying that these people feel like they're experts or they don't think that they're experts, but rather the expert is the knowledge version of the perfectionist. For an expert, they only feel competent by the amount of quantity of knowledge that they have. There's always one more book to read, one more degree to get before they will start feeling competent. And it's this relentless pursuit to reach this end of knowledge that can cause you to take months or even years to get to your goal. They're waiting for one day to wake up and to say, okay, I feel competent now. Then we have the natural genius. And again, this doesn't mean that they are a genius or that they think that they're a genius, but rather they believe that true competence means having inherent intelligence and ability. Things should come easy for them. They need to pick up things quickly, because if they don't, they are going to judge themselves as lacking. For them, there's no such thing as the learning curve. They expect to hit the ground running. And then, second last one is our soul list. They believe that true competence is about unaided achievement. They don't ask for help. Because if they were really competent, they wouldn't need help. And they feel that they should be able to figure everything out on their own, and they rarely seek things like tutoring, advice, or coaching. And finally, the superhuman. This is the perfectionist on steroids. Their competence is on the fact of about how many roles they can fulfill at a master level. Think of it as a superhuman student. Not only do they need to be academically good, but they need to achieve on the sports field, and they need to be involved in student council or student council leader. In terms of entrepreneurs, they feel that they need to master all aspects of business. And for employees, a lot of the time they feel that they need to master equally well functions that require two different skill sets, that of strategy and the other one of execution. So, do we even need to take this poll as to what we feel like, which type we are? Perfectionist? All right. Expert? Any natural geniuses? No? Okay. Soloist? And superhuman. All right. The bad news is that this is the core of your feelings. The good news is that there is a solution. The second tool to overcome imposter feelings is the tool of reframing. Now, it's estimated that 70% of people have experienced imposter feelings at one time or another. So that means we're actually in the majority. But wouldn't you like to know about the other 30%? Now, in that group, that other 30% that have never had imposter feelings, you've got one group that have a bigger problem, and they've got an oversized ego. They think that they know more than what they actually do. Now, that's not a group of people we want to look to. What we want to look to is the people that are genuinely humble. They have never felt like an imposter, and we want to understand this group more. Because the only difference between those that feel like imposters and those that don't is that in the same situation, they think differently from each other. And this is fantastic news, because it means all that we need to do is understand how they think. An example of the different thought processes is that of an American journalist. She had an impressive track record, but each new assignment she was plagued by this constant fear of screwing up. So she decided to go and speak to her producer, who she said was as competent, and ask him how he thought about certain things. And we're going to just have a look at what their conversation looked like. She said, "When you're on a story," I asked him, "do you ever think it's not going to work out?" "Sure," he said, "all the time." So then she asked, "Do you worry about it?" Again, he said, "Sometimes," not quite sounding as sure. She said, "When it doesn't work out, do you usually figure it's your fault?" "No," he said. "Suppose it is your fault. Does it make you feel terrible?" "Nah," he said. "Why not?" he looked at me and said, "Aren't I entitled to make a mistake once in a while?" If you knew that you were entitled to make a mistake once in a while, I'm not talking about when we're constantly making mistakes, because that's another problem. That's a problem of training. But if you knew that you were entitled to make a mistake, have an off day, not do everything perfectly, there would be nothing for you to feel like an imposter. The problem is that feelings change last. So the only way we can stop feeling like an imposter is to stop thinking like an imposter. Before we go on, we need to clear something up. Imposter syndrome is not a superpower. There's many talk, especially recently, about how imposter is a good thing. But why should working hard be driven by your fear? Why should our motivation be driven from the fear of being exposed as fraud? There must be another reason. Right. And there is a third choice. This is the third option, to choose to think like people who are genuinely humble and never felt like an imposter before. We call them the humble realist. And they recognize their skills, they take healthy pride in their accomplishments, but they also understand that they have limitations, and they have a very healthy view of what failure means. And the way to do this, to start thinking like a humble realist, is to reframe our thoughts. That when we start having this conversation in our head, we stop to think, well, how would a humble realist do? Now, I'm not talking about giving yourself a pep talk just before you're about to come up to the podium, all right? But rather, a humble realist thinks about these three things very differently. He understands the meaning of competence. He thinks and responds differently to failure and mistakes. And he responds differently to fear. So let's reframe competence for the perfectionist. Not everything can or needs to be perfect. There is good enough. Perfectionism is rejected because it slows us down. Reframes for the expert. A humble realist doesn't feel shame when they don't know something. They realize that they are a work in progress. And they reframe the thoughts of, I have no idea what I'm doing, to, I've never done this before, but I'm going to figure it out. Or, I don't know everything, but I'm smart enough to find out. And wow, I'm going to learn a lot. Now, you may have the fear of sounding stupid by putting your hand up in a class and asking a question. But have you ever had it that somebody else asked the same question you needed, and the lecturer says, hey, that's a really good question? Right. The key here is to not know with confidence, to be able to put up your hand and say, I don't know, please explain more. The reframe for the natural genius is knowing that there is always a learning curve to things. That some things are going to be easy for us, and other things we're going to need to work at. For our soloist, instead of seeing it as a sign of incompetence to ask for help, we see it as something that is wise. The saying that goes, what is the bravest thing you have ever done? And that's to ask for help. Woodrow Wilson, who was a US president, he said, I use not only the brains I have, but the brains I can borrow. And then for the superhuman, no one excels at everything. and especially nobody excels at everything at the same time, you can still set high standards for yourself as long as you give permission to be just a mere mortal like the rest of us. To act like a humble realist, we need to have a healthy response to failure and to mistakes. To make a mistake is not to fail. Nobody wins them all. There's always a loser and a winner in sport. But does the losing team, they might sit on the bench and cry, but they don't quit after losing a game. Rather, they go back, they review the game tapes, and they say, how could we have improved? So you can be disappointed, crushingly so, all right? But don't feel ashamed. Rather, see constructive feedback as a gift. It is something that a humble realist goes and seeks out. How can I improve myself? And if you continuously see yourself as a work in progress, then it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to sometimes fail. How many of you would like to be confident 24/7? Okay. Well, unfortunately, that's not how it works. We struggle with confidence throughout our lives. We have periods where we are confident and moments when we fear and have fear and self-doubt. But a humble realist, despite the fear, jumps in. Right? They trust their ability to figure it out as they go along, and they know that they can ask for help when they need it. Did you know that your body does not know the difference between fear and excitement? Those sweaty palms, that dry mouth, right, that feeling in your stomach, it's the same feeling you have when you're excited. So when you're walking up to the podium or when you're walking into that job interview, you need to keep telling yourself, I'm excited, because your body wouldn't know. And finally, you need to keep going on regardless. This is regardless of all of these messages that we've come to receive, but most importantly, regardless of how confident you feel. You know, it's not about the cliche of just fake it till you make it, but rather it's this understanding that we are never going to feel 100% confident. So get on with it and know that the more you do something, the more confident you are going to feel. Now, I know there's been a lot of information that we've essentially tried to take 40 years of research and to cram it into a single hour. But the most important thing that I would like you to take away from this is that when you start feeling like an imposter, make use of the 3 simple tools that we've discussed today. Normalize that imposter feeling. It's a normal feeling, and why wouldn't you feel like that? Reframe those imposter thoughts. Start changing the conversation in your head. And then thirdly, keep going on, regardless about how confident you may feel, because the more you do, the more confident you are going to feel. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but if you do have any questions, please, during the tea break, do come up to me and we can chat. But I want to leave you with one last thing, and that's to say, you may feel like an imposter, but deep down, you know you are not an imposter. You have everything you need right now to achieve most of the goals that you have set for yourself. You might not achieve them easily. You might not achieve them perfectly. You're certainly not going to achieve them without help. And there is going to be setbacks along the way. but you can do it. Because it's not just about you. Everyone loses when bright people play small. Thank you.